Okay, let's think about this for a second. Why does any organization exist? I mean, some make widgets, some offer services. But the church, what's its unique purpose? It feels different, right? Today, we are going to take a deep dive into some really fascinating source materials, all about what they call the Missional Church Shift. And the big question we're wrestling with is, well, how can the church be truly effective, like really effective in its mission? Now, you might think, oh, it's about programs, methods, doing the right things. But what we found in these sources reveals a much more nuanced journey, maybe even surprising. So our mission here today is to explore how our understanding of what the church is and what it does, how that has evolved. We'll look at the challenges, why these one-size-fits-all solutions often fall flat, and ultimately what it really means for a church to be effective right there in its own unique local place.
Yeah, and what's really foundational, what the sources hammer home, is that the church, it's distinct. It's not like most groups that exist primarily for their members. Instead, it exists because, well, as Ephesians 3:10 puts it, God chose the church as his instrument to make known his manifold wisdom in the world. That outward focus, that purpose beyond itself, that's absolutely key to understanding this whole missional shift we're exploring.
It makes sense, though, doesn't it? To think, hey, this worked great over here. Let's just plug it in everywhere else. Seems logical.
Totally. But that's exactly where the frustration came in, according to these sources.
Okay.
They tell this story about a leader called Ed, and he found that these surefire, guaranteed, great new whiz-bang programs, his words, they just weren't working in my church or the churches we were starting.
So he's trying all the supposed best practices and just nothing.
Exactly, which leads to the big question, why? Why wasn't it working? And the material suggests it's because the, quote, cultural code in his community, say Erie, Pennsylvania, it was just fundamentally different from the cultural code where the experts lived, maybe like South Barrington, Illinois.
Ah, okay. So it's not about effort. It's about the context being different.
Precisely. They realized we were living on different mission fields, different cultures, different assumptions. So these blanket statements like, oh, small groups are the only way, or you absolutely must have contemporary worship, they just didn't connect because the communities do not respond to the same approach.
Right.
So the really insightful leaders, they started thinking like missionaries, but in their own backyard, they started asking, okay, how do I take this unchanging faith and actually present it effectively here, in a retirement community, or maybe in an artist's commune, or even on the Lower East Side of Manhattan? It's about adapting the how, not the what.
That makes sense. So this idea of being missional, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. You mentioned earlier there were these movements before it. Let's unpack those a bit. The sources talk about two main ones, right? Starting with the church growth movement.
Yeah, exactly. So back in the 1960s, this started with Donald McGavran, and Peter Wagner really popularized it later. The main question they asked was basically, how can we be more effective in reaching people? Simple enough. And honestly, it brought some really valuable insights. Stuff about organizing for growth, how to welcome guests, intentional outreach, things people just weren't writing much about before then.
Okay, sounds positive. But there was a catch.
There was. The sources say the movement eventually became too filled with methodological mania.
Methodological mania? What does that mean?
It means like every book promised, do these 5 things and your church will grow. Guaranteed. But then the next book might have 5 different things, sometimes even contradicting the first one. So pastors got really frustrated, Trying to keep up with the latest guaranteed method, the sources call this an anthropocentric emphasis, meaning human-centered, focused on tools, techniques, our methods.
Got it. So very focused on the doing rather than maybe the why or the context.
Right.
So if that method-heavy approach caused frustration, where did things go next? You mentioned a shift towards health.
Exactly. The pendulum swung. In the 1990s, people started looking at pastors who seemed to be leading, quote, successful churches. Think Rick Warren, Bill Hybels, Steve Jogren. And their emphasis shifted. They said, look, healthy churches built around certain key values and a passion for the lost would grow. The idea was, focus on getting healthy on the inside and growth will naturally follow.
Okay, so internal focus driving external results. Sounds reasonable.
It does, but again, the temptation was just to copy this surface stuff. Like, okay, wear Hawaiian shirts, say lost people matter to God, do some servant evangelism projects, but just mimicking those things often did not work. Unless, as the source says, they usually were in similar communities to the original churches.
So context still mattered hugely, even when focusing on health.
Absolutely. Even Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Church, hugely influential. It was really more a description of his church Saddleback than a universal blueprint you could just copy and paste anywhere. So while this church health focus was valuable, the potential downside, the sources point out, was it could become too church body focused, almost navel-gazing, leading to a kind of blindness to the community, blindness to other races, and blindness to other approaches, because the main focus was internal health.
Okay, so we've seen this progression. First, all about external methods didn't quite work universally. Then focus on internal health valuable, but potentially too inward-looking. So is the missional church idea trying to blend these, looking both inward and outward?
That's a great way to put it. The missional church idea, as the sources describe it, builds upon the ideas of church growth and church health. It doesn't discard them entirely, but it integrates them into a full-blown missions focus. And that mission is both local, right, in their local mission field, and global, the ends of the earth. It's not seen as just, the next fad or just another phase. It's framed as a full expression of who the church is and what it is called to be and do.
A full expression.
Yeah.
And how does that look different in practice? The sources mentioned some shifts.
Yeah, several key ones. Moving from programs to processes. So less about running events, more about ongoing journeys. Moving from models to missions. Less about copying a successful model, more about discerning your specific mission. A big one. Moving from attractional to incarnational.
Okay, attractional versus incarnational. Break that down a bit.
Sure, attractional is like build something cool and get people to come to us. Great music, great programs, attract them in. Incarnational is more about going out to where people are, living amongst them, understanding their world, being present in the community, like Jesus did, hence incarnational. It also involves shifts from uniformity to diversity, recognizing different expressions are needed, and crucially from decisions to disciples, not just getting a hand raised, but helping people grow fully. And maybe my favorite, from seating to sending. It's not just about filling seats on Sunday, it's about sending people out into the world Monday through Saturday.
Wow, that's a significant reorientation. From seeding to sending. I like that.
Yeah.
But moving from attractional to incarnational or embracing diversity, I imagine that runs into roadblocks pretty quickly.
You bet. And the sources identify a huge one, maybe the biggest one.
Which is?
Our own preferences.
Yeah. That makes sense. It always comes down to what we like, doesn't it?
It often does. The sources actually call it the sin of preferences, which is pretty strong language. But the point is, being missional does not mean doing things the way we like them. It means being willing to let the church take the best shape that it can in order to reach a specific culture, even if that shape isn't our personal favorite.
So like the classic example.
Yeah.
The style of worship music.
That's a perfect example. It often becomes this battle, right, between maybe the leader's preference for, say, contemporary worship and maybe the longtime member's preference for traditional hymns. And that conflict over style can totally derail the actual mission of reaching the community.
Because everyone's digging their heels in about what they prefer.
Exactly. The sources call it preference slavery. We become slaves to our own tastes. And they point to the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 9 as the counterexample. He says basically, look, I'm free, I could do things my way, but I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. I become all things to all people so that by all possible means, I might save some. That's the shift. From being a slave to our preferences to becoming, in Paul's words, a slave to others for the sake of the gospel. It requires real selflessness.
Okay, that's a powerful challenge. Be selfless, adapt to the culture, don't just copy models. But how do churches actually do that? How do they navigate being culturally relevant without, losing their way or water things down? It feels like you could easily get lost.
That's a real danger, and that's where the sources introduce this framework they call the missional matrix. It's meant to provide some guardrails, some guidance.
The missional matrix. Okay, what's involved in that?
It basically brings together 3 core theological disciplines. Think of them as 3 legs of a stool, all needing to be strong and balanced. And crucially, the sources insist all 3 must be based on Scripture. Scripture provides the biblical boundaries.
Okay, so what are the 3 legs?
First is Christology. That's basically understanding who is Jesus, what did he do, and based on that, what does he send us, his followers, to do? What's the core message and mission?
Got it. Who Jesus is and what he calls us to. What's second?
Second is missiology. This is about the how. What are the actual forms and strategies we use to effectively share the message and expand the kingdom in our specific context? How do we translate the what from Christology into effective action here and now?
Okay, Christology, the what and why, missiology, the how, And the third?
The third leg is ecclesiology. This asks, what is the appropriate expression of a New Testament church in this particular context? What should the church actually look like and be like to be faithful and effective right here?
So it's not just what we do, missiology, but who we are as a gathered community, ecclesiology, all based on who Christ is, Christology.
Exactly, and all grounded in Scripture. This framework is important because remember how we talked about the earlier movements? The church growth movement, the sources argue, often lacked a strong scriptural basis for its methods. It was too anthropocentric, too focused on human techniques. And the church health movement, while maybe stronger theologically, could become too ecclesiocentric, too focused inward on the church itself, potentially losing sight of the outward mission.
Right. So this matrix tries to keep everything in balance. Christ, mission, and church, all under Scripture.
Yes. And that balance is crucial because the sources warn, if you neglect one part, things go wrong. For example, if you really emphasize missiology being relevant, adapting to culture and Christology, but you neglect ecclesiology, what the church distinctively is according to Scripture. The big danger is something called syncretism.
Syncretism.
Yeah.
That's like blending things together that shouldn't be blended.
Precisely. It's mixing up the gospel with the world so that you can't tell a difference. You become so focused on fitting in, on being relevant, that you lose the distinct message and identity you were supposed to bring.
And the sources see this as a real risk today.
They do. They mention George Barna's research, specifically his book, Revolution. He tracked this trend. Back in 2000, maybe 70% of Christians primarily connected through a local church. But he projected that by 2025, that could drop to maybe 35%. At the same time, people involved in alternative faith communities, house churches, online groups, whatever, might rise from 5% to 35%.
Wow, that's a huge shift away from traditional church structures.
It is. And while the desire for, say, more authentic relationships driving some of that shift is understandable, the concern the sources raise is if people disconnect entirely from a biblically grounded understanding of church ecclesiology, even while trying to follow Jesus' Christology and be on missiology, they risk becoming too tied to the world, essentially syncretized, losing that distinctiveness.
So the solution isn't just leaving the church structure, but rethinking the structure itself through this missional lens.
That seems to be the argument. The new course needed, as the sources put it, is a biblically grounded expression of church that deeply understands Jesus and his call, Christology, knows what it means to be on mission in its specific context, missiology, and understands what it means to be an appropriate, faithful expression of church in its part of the world, ecclesiology. It's about being both deeply rooted and culturally engaged, distinct but connected.
Man, we've covered a lot of ground here, from those early, maybe overly simplistic growth programs through the focus on internal church health and landing on this really comprehensive, holistic missional approach. It's quite a journey.
It really is.
Yeah.
And I think if you boil it all down, the core takeaway from these sources seems to be this. The most effective church isn't necessarily the biggest or the slickest or the one that perfectly copies some famous model. It's the one that figures out how to break the code, as they say, in its own unique neighborhood. It needs to be deeply rooted theologically, know its why, its who, its what, but also incredibly adaptable, humble, and selfless in how it engages the culture right outside its doors. It's a constant learning process, really.
In a dynamic learning posture. I like that. So maybe something for you, the listener, to think about after hearing all this. What are the cultural codes operating in your community, in your neighborhood, your workplace, the groups you're part of? What makes them tick? And here's the challenging part. How might setting aside some of your own preferences, the things you like, be the very first, maybe most crucial step toward truly engaging the unique mission field that's right in front of you?